suck. New Orleans is the home of the blues, but California's my home with Mary Lou.
Edwin Canistraci here. A drink to the late and great Jeff Beck. And we're gonna the Glenn Levitt here. Founders Reserve. There. In the same way that Jeff Beck was the founder of hard rock. So this is kind of sad. Jeff Beck, he passed away last week. I don't know when this video is going to come out. It might take me a while to edit. So with Jeff Beck, admittedly, in the past, have been more of a casual fan. I knew he was an innovative guitarist. I knew about some of the things he did with the Yardbirds and how he was one of the first guitarists to use distortion and feedback and fuzz pedals and all that on records in the mid-60s. I had Roger the Engineer, I had that album, and I had the first two Jeff Beck group albums, Truth and Beck Ola, and I loved those albums. But that's it, that's all I had. So I was a casual Jeff Beck fan. However, after he passed, which happens sometimes, after an artist passed, sometimes you look into their work a little bit more than perhaps you did beforehand, and before you know it, I got totally lost in Jeff Beck. Just did the deep dive, and I was just loving so much of what I was hearing that before I knew it, within a few days, I was just buying Jeff Beck related album after Jeff Beck related album, and before I knew it, within a week, I owned every studio album that Jeff Beck was part of, from the Yardbirds, from his first album with the Yardbirds, all the way to his 1980 solo album. So essentially, I have now every studio album that Jeff Beck plays on from the 60s and 70s. And I've been listening to these albums all week long, and I thought, I might as well do a beginner's guide, because I myself was a beginner. Like a week ago, I was a beginner. But I don't feel like I'm a beginner anymore, because now I've done the deep dive, and I got my notes. I got my notes because I might not remember every date and person he played with, because I'm still relatively new to the world of Jeff Beck, short of those few albums I mentioned earlier. When it comes to these albums and what I think people just getting into Jeff Beck like myself should get into, and what they should know about his chronology of albums and how he changed music forever, I think I'm up to the task. Let's see how well I know my Jeff Beck now. That's right, after 1 week crash coursing Jeff Beck, now I recognize that Jeff Beck is the second greatest guitarist of all time. Yeah, I still gotta give it up to Jimi Hendrix. I think Jimi Hendrix is the greatest guitarist of all time. Not my favorite, one of my favorites, but I'm saying objectively, I think Jimi Hendrix is the greatest guitarist of all time. But objectively, I think Jeff Beck's the second greatest, and we wouldn't have Hendrix. Hendrix wouldn't do a lot of the things he did in 67 if Jeff Beck wasn't doing the things he was doing in 1965 and 1966. Yeah, that's right. 2 years before Hendrix's first album came out, he was changing music, rock music as we know it, and he almost single-handedly created hard rock. A lot of people don't talk about when hard rock was invented. They go from rock and roll to heavy metal. But before that, we had the creation of hard rock. I used to think it was Revolver. 1966, the Beatles, Revolver. I used to say, I think that's the first hard rock record. But nah, I don't think that anymore. I think we're not there yet. We're not there yet. First, Jeff Beck has to join the Yardbirds. That's right. Eric Clapton was in the Yardbirds with their first album, which was just a live album. Yeah, it was a live album. 5 Live, Yardbirds, 1964. And so Jeff Beck has nothing to do with this album. It's Eric Clapton. But we're going to come back to it, because this album does encroach on a Jeff Beck album in a little bit. Jeff Beck first appears on the 1965 album, their first studio album, For Your Love. That's right, featuring the hit single, For Your Love, which featured Eric Clapton, not Jeff Beck. But Eric Clapton played on that song, and he hated it, and then he's like, okay, later, bozos, you're going too pop for me. Because Eric Clapton was a blues purist. But you hear on For Your Love, Jeff Beck only plays on a couple songs, but the guitar playing's better than Eric Clapton's on those couple songs. It's more innovative, it's a little edgier, it's a little punchier. I love Eric Clapton, nothing against him, one of the greatest guitarists of all time. Jeff Beck's better. That's it. Just facts. Science. Jeff Beck's better. All you have to do is listen to what Eric Clapton was doing in the Yardbirds and then hear what Jeff Beck did. Especially once the band really became his band. And that's the next album. Same year, 1965, Have a Rave Up with the Yardbirds. God damn. Now this is the album that really got me into the Yardbirds this week. I get it now. Now I get why Aerosmith and Guns N' Roses and Dokken and everyone, all these hard rock guys in the 70s and 80s are always talking about the Yardbirds. God damn it, this is proto-Aerosmith right here. Yeah, that's right, Train Kept a Rollin'. But before we even get to Train Kept a Rollin', let's just talk about this album. This album was released in 1965, okay? The Beatles were doing Help. Great album, not hard rock by any stretch of the imagination. The Rolling Stones weren't hard rock yet. And Jimi Hendrix was still 2 years before his first album comes out. And Eric Clapton's being a blues purist before Cream. This is a year before Cream. It's Jeff Beck that's coming in here and bringing this new hard edge to the guitar playing. You got the Train Kept a Rollin'. Train Kept a Rollin' is a cover, but the Yardbirds totally rearranged it, and Jeff Beck's aggressive guitar playing on this is definitely hard rock. In 1965, nothing was harder than this. This version's just as hard rocking as the Aerosmith version, in my opinion. And then a couple years later, in the movie Blow Up, oh well, hold on, we're not there yet. Right now, 1965, Train Kept a Rollin'. This was the beginning of hard rock right here. But it's not just here. We have the hit single, their second big hit song, Heartful of Soul. Heartful of Soul features innovative, groundbreaking electric guitar playing by Jeff Beck. I knew this song. I always liked this song. I always thought this song was like a 1966 song. I didn't realize it was a 1965 song. And it actually came out one day before the Rolling Stones' I Can't Get No Satisfaction. So I always thought I Can't Get No Satisfaction was like the beginning of that fuzzbox distorted guitar hook. But no, it was this song. It beat it by one day. By one day it came out before it. And as great as I Can't Get No Satisfaction is, short of that fuzzbox, which was innovative, it's still more or less a rock and roll song. I wouldn't call it hard rock, and I definitely wouldn't call it psychedelic rock. Whereas Heartful of Soul is a psychedelic rock song, in my opinion. It definitely evokes more of that vibe, and there's this Eastern quality to it. Initially, the band tried to play that part for sitar, but then Jeff Beck said, no, I can do it with my guitar. It'll be easier. It'll be in the same key and everything. So he played this electric guitar line in this new fluid way. It's kind of like proto-metal here. Like he's the first guy before Hendrix. Before anyone else, he was doing this electric fluid new kind of guitar playing, and he created this hook, and it has this Eastern vibe, and it should be noted, this is a couple months before the Beatles did Norwegian Wood, in which they used the sitar. That was in the fall. Rubber Soul came out in the fall of 65. This is the summer, early summer. It's June. This came out in June. It might seem like I'm being a little OCD with the months here and the exact years, but you gotta know, in this time period, in the mid-60s, a few months made a difference. It was like evolutionary continental shifts were made in just a few months. That's how much music was changing. I mean, compare what the Beatles were doing on Help with stuff like Still I'm Sad and Heartful of Soul. The Yardbirds got there first. I didn't know that. Then you got Evil Hearted Woman. Woo! Do you hear that? Dun, 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 dun. It's like doom metal. You hear what Jeff Beck's doing? It's dark, meaty, soulful, beautiful guitar chords. I love so much of what I love about guitar playing comes from Jeff Beck, and I didn't know. You're a Better Man Than I's great. Their version of I'm a Man, Jeff Beck playing the studio version, stronger than the live version they did with Clapton. No disrespect, that was good, but this is great. Everything's just amazing on this. Here's the problem. Problem is, unlike the Beatles who stopped touring, the Yardbirds were constantly touring. They kind of squeezed in studio sessions whenever they could. They didn't devote themselves to the studio stuff as much as the Stones and the Beatles did. Even though what they were knocking out when they were in the studio was more innovative than both bands. Like they were actually more innovative than both the Stones and Beatles. And that's saying a lot because the Beatles and Stones were both highly innovative in 1965. But the Yardbirds were even more so. But the problem is, they put this album out, and it's only the first side is all the new studio tracks of Jeff Beck. And then the second side is songs from that 1964 live album for Eric Clapton, 5 Live Yardbirds. And it's good stuff. And hey, I'm sure in the mid-60s, if you were some young shaggy-haired guitar dude, you loved both sides, and they're both good. But from an album-oriented standpoint, this kind of begins a kind of issue with the Yardbirds. Like, they don't really think in terms of albums as much as they probably should be. And like even the album cover is like kind of a throwaway British Invasion album cover. Looks like one of those early Capitol Beatle albums. If they just like knocked out a couple more new studio songs in the style of the first side of this album and had a vaguely trippy album cover, kind of like Rubber Soul, I think history would have been a little different. I think everyone would have been talking about how this was like the most innovative album of all time. But they didn't finish it. They filled it up with some old live tracks. And I think that, to a degree, affected the Yardbirds' legacy. But you know what? All I know is when I listen to this album, especially that first side, it's some of the most innovative hard rock music you'll ever hear. And it's hard rock. This is the beginning of hard rock. So as far as I'm concerned, Jeff Beck and the Yardbirds invented hard rock. And then they continued even more so with another innovative song in 1966, Shapes of Things, full-fledged psychedelic rock song. Yeah, in early 66, they did Shapes of Things. This is, again, a year before Hendrix's first album. It's a year before Pink Floyd's first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. This is full-fledged psychedelic rock. It's electric, it's hard rocking, it has that whole amazing psychedelic breakdown section. It's an amazing song. And it just shows you how innovative Jeff Beck was. The guy's a musical genius. They then record, I would say this is their most proper album, and that's the album I did have for many years, although I appreciate it now more than I did before. It's an album that is known by a lot of names. Usually people call it Roger the Engineer, but officially it's a self-titled album. So it's called Yardbirds. In America, I believe it was called Over, Under, Sideways, Down, which was the most known song from the album, which is another innovative, cutting-edge, great hard rock track. That's right, psychedelic hard rock, whatever you want to call it. But this is a very modern sounding song for 1966. It was used prominently in the movie Observe and Report. Very good movie, great soundtrack cue. And you hear Jeff Beck's guitar in the playing like in the beginning. Again, before Hendrix's first album. Listen to that electric guitar line in the beginning. It's amazing, so innovative, great song, and it's a great album. I used to think the album was a little spotty and inconsistent. I don't think that anymore. It's really grown on me. I love every song on it. There's a couple like Britishy kind of novelty songs on it that was very common for the mid-60s, and they didn't quite match the Beatles or even the Who when it came to songs like that. But when it's on, this album's on a whole other level. You know, Lost Woman, amazing. Love the bass in the beginning. Jeff Beck's doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Amazing rockin' song. Taking the blues to a new electric place that it never was before. Again, you could hear Jimi Hendrix was very inspired by what was going on in this album. The single Over, Under, Sideways, Down, amazing song. The Nazz Are Blue, featuring Jeff Beck on vocals. He's now singing vocals, does a great job. Kind of pre-ZZ Top, you know, bluesy, but, you know, with a kind of sense of humor and swagger to it. I love the Nazz Are Blue. Jeff's Boogie's also a great instrumental track, which shows that Jeff Beck, he sings with his guitar. Now, this is actually something that foreshadows where his career will go later on, because it's an instrumental and he sings with his guitar. And there's a lot of playfulness and humor, and I love that. Turn into Earth, great atmospheric track. Ever Since the World Began. Oh God, this is another song kind of like Still I'm Sad. Sounds kind of proto-goth. They sing about the devil on it and stuff. I love it. After this album, Jimmy Page, that's right, Jimmy Page, the one and only Jimmy Page, who is my personal favorite guitarist. I don't think he's the best. I don't think he's the most innovative. I think Jeff Beck is technically a better guitarist and more innovative. But Jimmy Page is my favorite overall when you talk about the whole thing, like the persona, practicing with black magic, the way he dressed, the legend around him, the darkness around him, his songwriting, his production work. When you just put it all together, Jimmy Page is my favorite guitarist. But there wouldn't be Jimmy Page without Jeff Beck, because Jimmy Page, as everyone knows, he was a master thief. You know, they say good artists borrow, great artists steal. Well, Jimmy Page stole from all the right people and then took that stuff where it needed to go when some of these other people, Jeff Beck included, didn't always take it. So Jimmy Page came into the Yardbirds, and he's paying a lot of attention to what's going on. And, him and Jeff Beck, they were bros, and they were sharing a lot of shit. But then Jimmy Page kind of stole that shit later on. But we're not quite there yet. For a fleeting moment, these two amazing motherfuckers are in the same band together. And they record a single that in 1966, we're still in 1966. Listen to this shit. Go on YouTube and listen to this very hard to say title, Happenings 10 Years Time Ago. Yeah, that's not the easiest title to say. Happenings 10 years time ago. Now, I have this and its B-side, Psycho Daisies, as bonus tracks on my Roger the Engineer. This single, god damn, this is again psychedelic rock, but I'd also call this proto-metal. This is very proto-metal. Definitely suggests what Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath are going to be doing. This is like a really heavy track. It's just dark and, oh man, listen to that guitar work. It's actually a dual lead. It's a dual lead from Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page. Before Judas Priest, before Thin Lizzy, you got a dual lead guitar attack from Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck on this track. And it's amazing. The B-side's awesome too. Psycho Daisies, where you hear Jeff Beck doing this amazing electric guitar work that really foreshadows what Jimmy Page does later on with Led Zeppelin. And it's Proto-Zeppelin. This single and B-side is Proto-Zeppelin. And this is in 1966. 1966, they're doing that. Plus, on top of it, they record this amazing song called Beck's Bolero. In 1966, they record Beck's Bolero, which Jimmy Page wrote. There's a little bit of a debate over that. Beck says he wrote it. Jimmy Page got the credit, though. Jimmy Page definitely came up with the rhythm guitar line, because that just sounds so Jimmy Page. Either way, for argument's sake, let's just say it's a collaboration. Collaboration between these two amazing guitarists, these two titans. And it's an instrumental. It foreshadows both where Page and Beck are going to be going in the future. But this song is amazing. Nothing sounded like this in 1966. Nothing. Beck's lead guitar work, it's proto-metal again. It would have just melted everyone's minds. But then he doesn't release it until 1967, and then as a B-side. But even then, that's the thing. This is how innovative this track was. Even in 1967, this still was like very, very innovative. And it just amazes me that this track was recorded in 66. Listen to that production. Just doesn't sound like it. But it was the B-side to this kind of hokey song. I think it was the first Jeff Beck solo song, Hi Ho Silver Lining. It was a hit in England, not a hit here in America. It's catchy enough, but I don't know. It sounds kind of like a Monkees or Neil Diamond song. It definitely should not be the kind of song that Jeff Beck is introducing people to as a solo artist, in my opinion. Although it did well in England, I guess, so it's all right. It's all right. I don't hate it, but man, it's all about the B-side. Beck's Bolero, amazing. One of the greatest tracks ever written. And then, this great lineup, in addition to the Happenings 10 Years Time Ago single, we were so lucky that in 1966, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, Michelangelo Antonioni, one of my favorite filmmakers, did Blow Up, which was a huge influence on Brian De Palma's Blowout many years later. He shot this film in 66, and there's a scene where David Hemmings, British actor, great actor, some horror fans might know him as the lead British guy in Dario Argento's Deep Red. Well, anyway, he's the lead British guy in this other Italian filmmaker's film. Although it's an English-speaking film and it takes place in London. Shows you swing in London in 66. It's an amazing movie. It's a great movie. And there's a scene where David Hemmings' character goes into this club and the Yardbirds are playing. And it's the Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page lineup. And they do Train Kept a Rollin'. Although, for copyright reasons, Keith Relf, the singer from the Yardbirds, he changed the lyrics. So the lyrics are different and they call the song Stroll On. You could hear it's like Train Kept a Rollin'. And this version's heavier than the Aerosmith version. It's like somewhere between the Aerosmith and the Motorhead version. It's really, really heavy. And again, you get to hear the two lead guitars of Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck. It's an amazing performance and the song sounds great. And it's interesting because Antonioni originally wanted Who, so he asked Jeff Beck to destroy the guitar on stage. But it's interesting, and it really kind of epitomizes Jeff Beck, is that unlike Jimi Hendrix and Pete Townsend, who were destroying the guitar on stage in a very theatrical kind of rock star move, and nothing against it. It's awesome when they did that. But Jeff Beck does it in the movie. He does it because he's frustrated because the amp's not working, and he starts hitting the guitar against the amp, and then he smashes the guitar frustration. It's not a rock star move, it's a frustrated musician move. That's so Jeff Beck, as you'll find out, and that's ultimately why he moves away from rock music, because when you really get down to it, he is more like a jazz musician. He's more like a Miles Davis type who never wanted to smile for the camera. That's the thing. He's just a pure musician, and that's what he's most comfortable being. He's not really a group guy. He's not a rock and roll guy. He's just a musician, and eventually he will figure that out for himself. But here, he's kind of struggling with it a bit, and that's kind of what led him away from the Yardbirds. And then Jimmy Page took it over. They did the 1967 album with just Jimmy Page, no more Jeff Beck, the Yardbirds. I'm just going to mention it now because if you want to find a missing link between happening 10 years ago and Stroll On and the first Led Zeppelin album, well, here you go. Here's the Yardbirds album. Although Keith Relf kind of pushed the band, at least in the studio, more in a pop direction. There's some good rockin' tracks on it, and you also have the recorded version of Jimmy Page's White Summer, which a lot of Led Zeppelin fans will know, live versions of that, and the Black Mountain Side would be combine it with White Summer. It's an Indian kind of piece, very great. And also, if you get the deluxe edition, I recommend the deluxe edition has Think About It. Great song. Should have been on the album. What's going on with that? It would have been like the best song on the album. Great B-side, actually, with Jimmy Page playing this great riff, and Aerosmith would cover it many, many years later on the Night in the Ruts album. Great song. And you could kind of hear, especially with the song Think About It, you could kind of hear how Jimmy Page is taken from Jeff Beck. He's taking his style and, emulating it and taking it kind of to the next sonic step. Well, he would anyway with the first Led Zeppelin album, but we're not quite there yet because I am going to talk about the Led Zeppelin album again in a second after we talk about what Jeff Beck, the guy we're here to talk about, his album, 1968's Truth. Wow, what an album. I love this album. I love Truth. Always loved Truth. It's one of my favorite albums. It was officially a Jeff Beck solo album. It's on the album cover. You can see it right there, Jeff Beck Truth. But this is the beginning of a short-lived, awesome band called the Jeff Beck Group. The Jeff Beck Group, it featured Mickey Waller, great drummer on drums, Nicky Hopkins on piano, who played with Beatles, the Stones, pretty much everyone in the 60s, great pianist, and Ronnie Wood, but not on guitar, on bass actually. And he's a great bassist, not just a great guitarist, great bassist, very talented. Ronnie Wood, who of course would later on join the Stones, and Rod Stewart. So Jeff Beck, in addition to inventing hard rock and changing electric guitar as we know it, he gave the world Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood. And Rod Stewart's amazing. I love how Rod Stewart sings on this album. It also has Beck's Bolero. Still in 1968, it still sounds like an innovative, fresh track, even though by that point it was 2 years old. This is another album that, even though Jimmy Page does not play on it with the exception of Beck's Bolero, it's a proto-Zeppelin album. In 1968, this is the next level of hard rock, and it sounds very modern for 68. It sounds like a 69 album, actually, in 1968. And again, in this time period, every year makes a difference. This is an amazing production. The guitars are loud, hard-hitting. They do a new version of Shapes of Things, and man, it's better than the original one. And, Rod Stewart, nothing against Keith Relf. I think he was a cool singer. He had a cool voice, and I like him a lot. He was a good singer. Unfortunately, though, he pushed the Yardbirds into kind of a poppier direction, and he's no Rod Stewart. So that's all I'm just saying. Rod Stewart, you can hear, this is like the next level of singing. Jeff Beck never played with a guy who sang this good before, so they're taking the fucking whole thing up to another level. And Shapes of Things, you could just hear how fluid and how much Jeff Beck has grown as a guitarist in just a couple years. It's an amazing version of the song. I love it. As much as I love the Yardbirds version, I love this one even more. Let Me Love You, which was actually an original blues rock song written by Jeff Beck and Rod Stewart, and it's a good track. I love the cover of Morning Dew, an amazing kind of lush, poppy, vaguely psychedelic rock song. Really dig that. They do Willie Dixon's You Shook Me, which of course would be on the first Led Zeppelin album that comes out the following year. And not only that, John Paul Jones plays organ on it. That's right, John Paul Jones, who who also, by the way, played bass on Beck's Bolero, which essentially was like the beginning of Led Zeppelin. In fact, Keith Moon played drums on that track. This was the session where Keith Moon famously said, when Jimmy Page suggested that they form a supergroup, Keith Moon said, it'd go down like a lead balloon or Led Zeppelin, depending on who tells the story. You shook me. Obviously, Jimmy Page got some ideas there, and you tell me it's a coincidence that John Paul Jones is on the track? Nah, that's not a coincidence. Can't be. Anyway, Rock Me Pimsoul. Is that how you pronounce it? Pimsoul? I don't know. It's awesome, whatever it is. Beck's Bolero, like I said, like I talked about a lot already. Blues Deluxe, another great original blues rock song from Jeff Beck and Rod Stewart. They were a pretty good songwriting team. They should have done more shit together. And another great cover of a Willie Dixon composition, I Ain't Superstitious. Woo! I think that's my favorite track on the album. I love their version of I Ain't Superstitious, man. It's just so sexy and badass. And Jeff is just making his guitar talk. The wonk, 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 wonk. Great soundtrack cue. This song is used in Martin Scorsese's Casino, one of my favorite films. Great moment when this song plays. But anyway, I, for a long time, have had this deluxe edition of Truth, which has a lot of the singles from this time period. You know, it's got Hi-Ho Silver Lining, Love is Blue, which is a nice little corny psychedelic pop instrumental from the late 60s. I like it. I love this whole album. I like the bonus tracks. Definitely get the remastered, expanded version of Truth. It's a great album. And then in the next album, they actually called it the Jeff Beck Group. Now he was officially calling it the Jeff Beck Group. And the next album was Beck Ola, and has Big Green Apple. Anyway, it's a great album. It's a great album. Not quite as great as Truth in my opinion, but it's like right on its ass. It's like really great. One song actually I like better than anything on Truth, and that's the second track, Spanish Boots. Woo! Now, here we go again. More proto Led Zeppelin. Sounds a lot like Heartbreaker a little bit, which would be on Led Zeppelin 2, which came out the same year. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, Spanish Boots, great hard rocking kind of proto metal track. Probably the heaviest thing Jeff Beck did with this band. And he co-wrote it with Ronnie Wood and Rod Stewart. Again, they're writing good songs, man. This was a great band. Too bad Jeff Beck let it slip through his fingers, because this was a damn great band. They do actually one of the few covers of Jailhouse Rock that I actually like. They make it nice and slow and sexy, and that bass line, damn, Ronnie Wood, amazing bassist. Plinth, Watered Down the Drain, that's a great track, and a really great instrumental that just fucking kicks ass. Rice Pudding, heavy, hard rockin', funky, kind of jazzy, all at the same time. This totally foreshadows where Jeff Beck would be going in the 70s. And it's a great album. I mean, if you love Truth, you got to also get Beck Ola. To me, it's like they're a two-hander. You got to get both these albums, because unfortunately, these are the only two albums that the original Jeff Beck group did. There is a reason why most people know Eric Clapton, they know Jimi Hendrix, they know Jimmy Page, where Jeff Beck is more of like a musician's musician. You know, like if you're a musician or hardcore heavy metal or hard rock fan, then you'll know Jeff Beck. But the mainstream, the general masses don't really know who Jeff Beck is. And I think it's because, he had this kind of personality where, he wasn't really a team player so much. Like, he didn't form a band. It was the Jeff Beck group. It was his group. And apparently his manager, too, was kind of trying to keep Rod Stewart and the rest of the band kind of in their place. Like, hey, this is Jeff Beck's group, not your group. Whereas look at Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page formed Led Zeppelin. He went into it like it's a band. He didn't call it the Jimmy Page Project, and he treated Robert Plant like an equal. All four members of Led Zeppelin were equals, even though Jimmy Page was the main guy. I mean, he was the guy that formed the band. He was producing them. He had the greater vision, but still on an individual basis, he treated each band member with a lot of respect, and they were a group. Right out of the gate, Led Zeppelin's a group. And the thing is, in 1969, after Truth came out, the first Led Zeppelin album came out. And as great as Truth is, and I love Truth, and I talked about this in the latest Rock Overy podcast where we talk about Led Zeppelin, and I'll leave a link to that below. But I do talk about it, and I felt a little bit bad about this because it made it sound like I was kind of dismissive of Truth. And, I said it was a good album and Jeff Beck was talented. We recorded this like a couple months ago. So A, Jeff Beck was still living at the time. And B, I hadn't done a deep dive yet, so I was a little ignorant. So I will say that I regret playing it down a little bit. Again, I wasn't like dissing Jeff Beck, and I wasn't saying that I didn't like the Truth album. I said I liked it. But the truth about Truth is I love this album. And yeah, it's not as innovative as the first Led Zeppelin album, but again, you gotta look at all these things from the year it came out. 1968. Truth is pretty damn innovative. And as I pointed out, we wouldn't have had the Led Zeppelin album if it wasn't for Truth. Essentially, Jimmy Page was taken from it. He was like, yeah, he was biting from that shit. And then he just took shit to the next level. But he did take shit to the next level. That's the thing. Led Zeppelin was sonically, it's a 69 album, but it sounds like 1970. Even the blues rock stuff, like You Shook Me, they just play it heavier. You could say that Jeff Beck plays in a more fluid, nuanced way. You could say that Rod Stewart is a more soulful, restrained vocalist. But ultimately, what was going to connect with the masses, and Americans especially, was not going to be restraint. It was going to be a full throttle assault to the senses, and that's what Jimmy Page did on the first Led Zeppelin album. And then they quickly followed it up with Led Zeppelin 2. So Bec Ola, as great as it was, for the first time, it wasn't the heaviest, most hard rock and innovative album out there. Although it's up there, and if you love those first two Zeppelin albums, again, you should love Truth and Bec Ola. I highly recommend them. And to me, it's like an important piece of that puzzle. The puzzle pieces that, when you put it together, create the beginning of heavy metal, what we refer to as heavy metal, like it's proto-metal. But then, this is again where Jeff Beck becomes a kind of counterintuitive guy. Obviously, with the success of the first two Led Zeppelin albums, and then on top of it, Black Sabbath has now dropped their first couple albums, you would think he would go heavier, like he's the guy who invented this shit. Jeff Beck invented this heavier, distorted kind of guitar playing. But instead, he pivots. He goes in the opposite direction. And not only does he alienate Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood, and they decide to leave, and they join the Faces, which was a reformed version of the Small Faces, and they start working on the first couple Rod Stewart solo albums, which are great. I highly recommend, especially the first three solo Rod Stewart albums with Ronnie Wood playing guitar on it. They're amazing albums. They're great albums. That Jeff Beck group, that could have been like a competitor of Led Zeppelin in the early 70s. You could have Rod Stewart singing some of those kind of poppy country-ish ballads, and who knows, he might have had Maggie May in the Jeff Beck group. You know what I mean? So they could have been like one of the biggest bands in the 70s, in my opinion, if he kept that band together. But he didn't. And then when he reformed them, the next two albums that he forms with this new Jeff Beck group, 1971's Rough and Ready and Jeff Beck Group, the album's just called Jeff Beck Group, from 1972. They're good albums. I like them. I only just got them last week, so, I haven't lived with them long, and I do enjoy them. They're good, straight up, rootsy rock albums with more R&B and jazz influence than he had before. This is kind of what I'm talking about, though. Jeff Beck goes more in a jazzy, rootsier direction. In some ways, foreshadows where he will go even further in the mid-70s. It's kind of the opposite of what a lot of people wanted, especially people that were kind of developing a taste for like harder rock and arena rock. And if you were like fans of the Yardbirds and Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and Cream and kind of stuff Clapton was doing by this point, and The Who, these albums, it's not surprising that they didn't really take off. They're subtle. They're subtle albums with impeccable musicianship. Jeff Beck's guitar playing is great throughout the two albums. You got Cozy Powell on drums. I love that. All roads lead to Cozy Powell, as I say many times whenever this guy always pops up in bands that I review. They're two good albums. They're good. They're not great. They're definitely not as awesome as Truth and Bec Ola. It does feel a little like Jeff Beck, heard the first couple of Zeppelin albums and the Sabbath albums and albums like that, and was just like, oh, fuck it. I'm not competing with that. I don't want to compete with that. I think he just maybe it was just a little too heavy for him. Maybe he just didn't like it. I don't know. He just went in a different direction. And that's fine. Artists have to go where their heart takes them and where they really want to go, and you definitely can't fault him for that. His instincts were, let's go jazzier and more R&B, and everyone else wanted music to get harder, so he pivoted. And the one thing that makes me think he was kind of aware of this was he then breaks up this latest group, this latest version of the Jeff Beck group, and he forms another band in 73, a band called Beck, Bogert, and Appice. And it's two guys from Vanilla Fudge. It's singer and bassist and drummer and singer. All the guys sang in Vanilla Fudge. But the bassist is actually the guy who has the most distinct voice, I think, from Vanilla Fudge. That's Tim Bogert. So Tim Bogert is the bassist and singer, and Carmine Appice. And so these two guys were in Vanilla Fudge. I think they should call this band Vanilla Beck, because that's essentially what it is. It's essentially Vanilla Fudge with Jeff Beck. Of course, Jeff Beck being in the band makes it a far more guitar-oriented band than Vanilla Fudge was. Beck, Bogert, and Appice. It's kind of a mouthful, but anyway, that was the name of the band. And they're good. They're better than the second Jeff Beck group, in my opinion. And this is a really, really, really good album. It's a really good album from 1973, self-titled, Beck, Bogert, and Appice. He's a man on a mission, and this is the mission statement. More hard rockin'. He's like, hey, I know that's what you kids like. Okay, I'm sorry that those last two Jeff Beck group albums were a little too jazzy and R&B for you. Okay, I'm going to give you some straight up hard rock, all right? Big arena rock kind of stuff. And you hear it out of the gate, Black Cat Moan. Jeff Beck actually does the lead vocals on this one. It sounds like Southern rock. It actually sounds like a lot like early ZZ Top or Leonard Skinner. It's a great song, amazing electric guitar work from Jeff Beck, what do you know? And it's a really great track. Lady's a great track too. Really great track. Appice does some pretty good lead vocals on it. And I love the vibe of Lady. It reminds me of that Cream song, I'm So Glad, but even better in that song. You know, it's very rocking and chugging along. Jeff Beck does some great guitar work. And you're like, yeah, now this sounds kind of like what you would have hoped the third Jeff Beck group album would have sounded like. There's two issues with this album that I think kept it from being as big as it could have been. It did a little bit better, I believe, than the last two Jeff Beck group albums, but not as good as the first two Jeff Beck group albums. A problem is, for one thing, the lead-off single was supposed to be Superstition. Yeah, now let me tell you about this. So this is Stevie Wonder's Superstition. Apparently, Stevie Wonder's classic album, Talking Book, which came out the year prior, Jeff Beck had recorded some guitar parts on that album. And the song Superstition, apparently, which I didn't know, came out of a jam session between Jeff Beck and Stevie Wonder. Jeff Beck was actually, he was playing that iconic drum beat in the beginning, and Stevie Wonder started playing the clavinet. I think that's what you call it, the clavinet, and it was real funky, and they got into a jam. And even though Stevie Wonder wrote most of the chords and music, he made a deal with Jeff Beck since it came out of a jam session. He said, this new band you're forming, this new band, Beck, Bogert, and Appice that you're forming, you can have Superstition. I want the songwriting credit, but you guys could have it, you could cover it, and you can release it as a single. Well, this is the thing, maybe because Jeff Beck is a perfectionist, or I don't know, doesn't pounce on things. I mean, to me, they should have rushed this out as a single, if anything, if not even the album. They take a year to finish this album. And in the meanwhile, Stevie Wonder knocks out Talking Book. By that point, Motown's like, hey, we're not sitting around waiting for these white boys to release this song. This is a hit. This is a goddamn hit record, Stevie. It's going to take your career to a whole other level. And Stevie was already a big deal. But Superstition and Talking Book would take him to a whole other level, and it led to a whole string of amazing albums that Stevie Wonder released in the 70s, which eventually I will do a video about. What I'm getting at is, if Jeff Beck was a little more proactive, he could have had Superstition out first. And then people would have thought Stevie Wonder's version, even though he wrote it, they would have thought that was like a cover of the Beck, Bogert, Appice version. You know what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying? I'm just saying that sometimes Jeff Beck didn't pounce on things like he should have. Like, I mean, Superstition, he could have been the first to get that out there. And their version cooks. It would have been a hit, especially if it came out before Stevie Wonder's version. I wouldn't say it's better than Stevie's version, but it's just as good. It's just as good in its own hard rocking way. It's a catchy ass track. Bogert does some great lead vocals on it. It's great. It's like, man, you should have put this out there fast. We got it now. I'm glad it was recorded. It's an awesome version of Superstition. I love it. And the second thing about this album, though, is all the hard rock songs kick ass. All the bluesy hard rock songs kick ass. It's exactly what you want from Jeff Beck in the early 70s. However, there's a couple ballads on here, like Oh to Love You. I just don't think the ballads are that great. That's just my opinion. They're not horrible, but they're not great. And this is kind of where, again, you're kind of missing Rod Stewart. Like, if Rod Stewart was in this band at this point, he would have been co-writing some amazing ballads and been singing them amazingly. Whereas these ballads, they're just kind of mediocre early 70s ballads. But ballads aside, most of this album's great. all the rockers rock. Like I said, I do like it better than the second Jeff Beck group lineup. Even though those albums weren't bad, I do like them, and I'm sure they'll grow on me. But this is a really good, solid hard rock album for the most part. And if you like bands like Grand Funk Railroad, actually I think it sounds more like Grand Funk Railroad than probably anyone else, but also like Cream and Hendrix, of course. And if you like a lot of Southern rock, like ZZ Top, Leonard Skinner, definitely check out this Beck Boger in a Piece album. And this is it. This is the only studio album they ever released because they fell apart. What do you know? What do you know? So again, I love Jeff Beck. He's awesome. He's an innovator. But obviously, fans and him they just weren't meant to be, all right? He's just not that kind of guy. He's just not that kind of guy. And this is going to lead us into the final section I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about 3 albums now, and this is going to be the conclusion to my Jeff Beck Beginner's Guide. Jeff Beck finally finds himself. Yeah, that's right. In 1975, Jeff Beck finally he owns up to it. I'm not a rock band guy. All right? I'm not going to have my Led Zeppelin. All right? It's done. That's just not my thing. That's Jimmy's thing. I'm a guitarist. I'm a guitarist first and foremost. I'm a musician first and foremost. I love all kinds of music. You know, I'm not just into hard rock. I just want to fucking play my guitar and do cool guitar shit. So in 1975, with producer George Martin, that's right, that George Martin of the Beatles, he records in 74 but releases in 75 Blow by Blow. This technically, you would call it like the second Jeff Beck solo album if you count the first Jeff Beck group album as solo, but I really don't. I think that's a band for the most part. So in a way, I really consider this the first true Jeff Beck solo album. It sets up what the rest of his career is going to be like. And it's when he essentially becomes a jazz artist. He's a jazz artist or a fusion artist. And it's all instrumentals. He's an instrumentalist now. It's like no more, I'm not trying to cross over with the rock crowd. I'm not trying to play arena rock. I'm not going to try to have hit records. I'm just going to be a musician that does really awesome, cool albums that are just pure music and moving with the times and putting my spin on it, putting my spin on current funk and fusion, and that's what he does throughout this album. It's great, and I really like it. I think the next one's even better, but let's hold off before we get to that. I just want to say that Blow by Blow, you can hear it's Jeff Beck finally being true to himself. Like I said, he kind of always was doing what he wanted to do, but I think with the Beck Boger and a Peace album, I think he was trying to give the rock audience and rock crowd a little more what he thought they wanted. And now it's just him going, fuck it, I'm just doing what I want to do. I just want to do what I want to do. I want to be like Miles Davis. I just want to do my thing and just play the guitar the way that Miles Davis played the trumpet. It sounds like a man that's liberated, that's finally free from having to be Mr. Rockstar. And he just does all these great instrumental versions. It's very funky. I would say it's like the average white band kind of music, but better. I think it's better in that band. And if you love fusion, if you love stuff like Herbie Hancock stuff in the 70s, like Headhunters and Fusion Miles Davis and a lot of stuff like that, or just like funky blaxploitation soundtracks and things like that, you'd love this. The last song is amazing. It's a masterpiece. It's a song called Diamond Dust. Beautiful, very cinematic, atmospheric, kind of dark jazz piece, and it's amazing, and his guitar work is amazing. Love Diamond Dust, and it's great, and it's a great album. But what's even better is the next one, which he released just the following year in 76. You see, now he's knocking albums out because this is what he really wants to be doing. You could tell he was very happy with Blow by Blow because he kind of does the same thing again, but this time he takes it to another level. I love this album. I think it's great. I think it's better than Blow by Blow even. And from what I've heard so far, this is my favorite thing he does after Beck Ola. After Beck Ola, I think this is his best thing, and that's Wired from 76. With Blow by Blow, he's treading water a little bit. But now he's got this extra layer of confidence because it worked. Because Blow by Blow worked. So now you can hear like he's got this extra swagger. It's got this extra swagger, and his playing is even more expressive and loose and free and fluid and adventurous and sensual, and it's even a little more hard rocking in spots. This is straight up fusion. Lead boots, awesome. Interesting that he spells lead like L-E-D, so I wonder if that's a little jab at Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin. Come Dancing, a funky song, kind of a funky, a little vaguely disco-ish. I love that. Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, amazing. Charles Mingus composition. I love the original Charles Mingus version. It's always been actually my favorite Charles Mingus song from his Mingus album, which I love. Love that album, my favorite Mingus album, and this is a great song. But you know what? As much as I love that version, this version's even better. Jeff Beck does with his guitar what Miles Davis does with the trumpet. He sings. He's singing with his guitar. It's amazing phrasing. It's beautiful. It's haunting, sensual, it's romantic. No disrespect to most rock guitarists, but they can't do stuff like this. I mean, maybe Jimi Hendrix, if he was still alive, if he was alive in the mid to late 70s, he might have been doing stuff like this. I'm actually sure he would have been. But he wasn't, and Jeff Beck was, and this is what he was doing. And I also have seen clips of him doing this song later live, and it's even better. Like, he just really expresses himself with Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. The second side's great too. It's all great. This is a great fusion album, and if you're open-minded and you just love hearing great musicianship and just hearing a man who's singing with his instrument, then you'll love Wired. I highly recommend Wired. And then we get to the last album I'm going to be reviewing, and it's the last album I own. I stopped here in 1980 with There and Back. I feel like they should call it There and Beck. Anyway, it's There and Back. This continues with the fusion direction. It's another instrumental album, but you can tell he's entering the 80s now. He's working with Jan Hammer. Is that how you pronounce it? Is it Jan or John? I'll say Jan. It's Jan Hammer, whose name I know very well because I'm a big Miami Vice fan. Yeah, it's the guy who did the score work and wrote the iconic Miami Vice theme. And in fact, the first song, Star Cycle, sounds like the Miami Vice theme. It sounds like this is where Jan Hammer first wrote that song, even though it changed a little bit, but this is essentially a prototype of the Miami Vice theme. And also, the keyboard line sounds a little like Eddie Van Halen's keyboard line in his cover of Dancing in the Streets. I could tell you, throughout this album, I'm listening to this, the first thing I thought was Eddie Van Halen must have really loved this album. Because if you look at the timeline, this album comes out in 1980. And right after 1980, with Fair Warning, Diver Down, 1984, Eddie Van Halen starts experimenting more and more with synthesizers. And that's what's going on in this album. Essentially, this is the synthesizer meets hard rock guitar album. Also has a kind of Tangerine Dream vibe to it, which also is fitting because the song The Pump was, like a lot of Tangerine Dream songs, was featured in the movie Risky Business. Great scene when they're driving to this song, The Pump. I love that song, The Pump. It's a slow, smooth, sexy song. The whole album is great. A lot of this stuff just sounds like 80s like music that you would hear in a cool movie or TV show. But nothing wrong with that. I love a lot of that kind of music. And when you see that this was released in 1980, you understand that this was very innovative. It sounds like this helped shape what music scores and TV scores sounded like in the 80s. It sounds like a lot of people were taking note, you know? Everyone from Eddie Van Halen to Michael Mann, maybe. You know, like they were all kind of taking note. So there you go. Jeff Beck is changing music yet again, but in a different, more subtle way with There and Back. And it's a really good album. I don't love it as much as Wired, but it's pretty damn good. It definitely makes me want to listen to more Jeff Beck albums. And this is where you can come in. If you're a huge Jeff Beck fan and you've been listening to Jeff Beck longer than I have, recommend his later albums. Tell me what other albums I should have, because I'm no longer a casual Jeff Beck fan. I'm apparently a hardcore Jeff Beck fan, and apparently he's one of my favorite musicians and artists of all time. I just didn't know it until last week. From a career standpoint, Jeff Beck was kind of a self-destructive guy during some key, crucial moments in his life, in his early years anyway, and he kind of allowed other people to kind of usurp him and kind of take hold of what really should have been his legacy. Like, he really should have been the guy who planted the flag for hard rock and heavy metal. Like, it's clear. But he's just one of these eccentric, idiosyncratic artists that's just a kind of island to himself that just wasn't who he was, you know? He let others have the glory. He let the Jimi Hendrixes and the Jimmy Pages have their glory. He just wanted to play like a beautiful guitar solo to Charles Mingus's Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. He just was his own man, a true artist in every sense of the word. This is for you, Jeff. Sorry I'm late to the party, but better late than never. And you out there, if you're new to Jeff Beck, definitely go to the albums that I talked up the most and just check this shit out. Buy these albums, support music, support real music, alright? That's all I gotta say. I'm pretty drunk now, so it's time to wrap up. But if you like this video, as always, subscribe, like, do all that stuff. Help me with the algorithms. Help me with the YouTube algorithms. Let's get good music up there. Let's get the discussion, the conversation about good music out there for people. All right? And listen to that Rock All Over You podcast episode where I talk about Led Zeppelin and gush over Jimmy Page the way I gushed all over Jeff Beck here. They're both geniuses. I love both these guys. And it's just amazing. It's just amazing, this music that was created in the 20th century. It should inspire everyone to this day. So that's it. I'm Eddie Canistracci. And once again, here's to you, Jeff.